from Mathieu Benoit from Microsoft on Azure Arc at scale with Kubernetes management. Thanks.
I'm Mathieu Benoit. I'm Cloud Solution Architect at Microsoft, and I'm really excited to talk during this Cloud Native Days Montreal about Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. Azure Arc is the response of a different scenario and customers' needs. First, how I could govern and operate across disparate environments. The second one is how I could ensure security across the entire organization. Third one is how I could still and keep enabling innovation and developer agility. So Azure Arc is very part of the Azure hybrid strategy. How I could attach and actually extend any data center and any cloud to the Azure control plane, which is known as the Azure Resource Manager. In other words, the Azure Portal. How I could grab and centralize and having the inventory of my different resources. So Azure Arc is very about three main resources. First, servers. Think about VM, virtual machine, Linux or Windows. Could be deployed on different location. Could be on different cloud. Could be on premises or at edge. The second one is about Kubernetes cluster. Any Kubernetes cluster certified by the CNCF. Could be on Azure, Red Hat OpenShift, and Red Hat OpenShift cluster you have. Could be on GKE, on Google Cloud or AWS with EKS. Minikube locally, Rancher, any Kubernetes cluster. The third one is about data services, database services, where you could have Azure database for Postgre or for MySQL, managed service deployed on your dedicated server. And for the private preview of this specific data services area, it will be on Kubernetes. So really exciting features over there as well. Today we will be focused on Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. And three main features for this area. How I could organize and again having the inventory across my environment of all my Kubernetes cluster, any type, anywhere, from across clouds, data centers, edge sites, and how I could centralize and having the governance within my Azure portal. The second feature is about how I could deploy and manage my applications, my Kubernetes configuration at scale. So with the fleet of my Kubernetes cluster. The third one will be about how I could ensure consistency, security, and monitoring with policy-based management. So how I could define, audit, and enforce configuration, again, across your entire organization. So let's see in action such feature. So I'm here on my Azure portal. And here I could list two types of resources. First, here my Azure Kubernetes service, and here the second type, Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. Here I just have the example of having Kubernetes cluster within Azure AKS, but again I could leverage Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes service with any Kubernetes outside Azure. So that there is this resource which will onboard any Kubernetes cluster, right? So what I could do here is switching to my terminal and grabbing actually my current context. So that's very where I'm on my local machine, and I have the list of the Kubernetes cluster I have access to. Again, could be on Azure, it could be on multi-cloud, anywhere. It's a Kubernetes cluster. I'm just grabbing the kubeconfig, and with that I could interact with this cluster. Here I have my current context on this specific cluster. And what simply I have to do to onboard this cluster is just run this specific command, az connected Kubernetes connect. I will give it a specific name, and I will create it on a specific resource group. But again, here I will grab my current context and just bind and onboard this cluster within Azure. So again, this cluster could be outside Azure, but here I'm creating and onboarding this connected Kubernetes service on Azure. So I have already run this command, so I won't run it again. If we are switching back here, that's this one, where now I have my resource within Azure. Again, it's a Kubernetes cluster wherever it could be. And from here, I have the ability to, for example, leverage features such I would like to tag, and having capabilities to search and having reporting within Azure about cost center, anything that I could have key value pairs as tags for this specific Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. Now what I would like to talk about is about configuration. Configuration is very about how I could deploy with GitOps. GitOps, it's a process to deploy Kubernetes resources. Here we are using and leveraging within Azure Arc the Flux CD, which is a very known tools for GitOps process. And here I could simply give some names, and Git URL could be a private or public repository. And I could provide this URL and some parameter to deploy, actually having this configuration within my Kubernetes cluster to be able to pull such deployment and leveraging the GitOps process. And if you are not familiar with GitOps, here Flux CD are giving these very well-known pictures and workflow where I'm a developer. I could commit my code for sure, but my YAML file, which will be my Kubernetes deployment. And I'm also pushing my images, Docker and container images, but I won't be able to apply because I don't have the right to kubectl apply. So apply my YAML file, my Kubernetes manifest file. I will push them and commit them in the repository, Git repository here. And I have previously deployed within my Kubernetes cluster Flux CD operator, which is with a configuration able to watch and synchronize my YAML file here to the desired state within my Kubernetes cluster. So it's always just pull, and the single place of truth is my Git repository now. So very interesting concept and very well known more and more with Kubernetes deployment. So that's what we are leveraging with Azure Arc for security perspective as well. So here I could define that here. Otherwise, I could switch to my terminal. So what I would like to show you first is my namespace. So if you see, I have already onboarded my cluster. I have my Azure Arc component. Now let's see, because I don't have it, I would like to deploy a specific application, which is Azure Vault. So I don't have any Azure Vault namespace, and I don't have any pod deployed on this namespace either, right? So here what I would like to do is going back here and showing you an example. So I have a repository and my Azure Vote app, which is a YAML manifest, where I could define I would like to create a namespace, a first deployment with my backend, which is a Redis image. After that, I have the service, which is a cluster IP, exposing this Redis deployment. I have my other deployment, which is a front end, and exposing this as a load balancer and public IP and load balancer service. So that's my manifest, and that's what I would like to deploy on this specific Kubernetes cluster. But again, I could repeat this configuration on different Kubernetes cluster as well. So going back to my terminal, again, I don't have anything on this specific namespace. Now, here is a command I could run. Easy Kubernetes configuration, create, giving a name on a specific Azure Arc, and giving the specific GitHub repository, specific subfolder, etc., and just hit enter. Here, going back here, I have no result, refresh. I have now this configuration in pending state, and it should be compliant in a few seconds. So now if I'm running again this command where I'm watching for the pod on this specific namespace, I should see in a few seconds my deployment happening. Once we are waiting for that, other configuration you could do is having, again, any Git repository, getting your YAML manifest, your application. It could be any cluster configuration. I have another example here where I'm using kurde, and I would like to deploy kurde as an Helm release on a Flux concept. So it's an Helm release where I would like to deploy kurde with a specific version and specific parameters. But it could be any Kubernetes manifest file you would like to deploy across your different Kubernetes cluster, and you just have to onboard them and add a Kubernetes configuration. It could be at the root folder or on a specific subfolder like we saw earlier. So going back here in the terminal, we could see that now we have pending, container creating, and now running. So if I'm running here, this command line giving me the pod, the service, the deployment, the replica set, I could grab here my public IP and see that now I have my application, the front end exposing my backend as a Redis cache. And in a few seconds, I should see and be able to render this website. That's not the purpose of this demonstration, but that's to show you how it's working. Now, what I would like to do, so again, let's imagine I would like, so I have this application and I could play around with this application. Now this application deployed on one Kubernetes cluster. Again, I could repeat this configuration to set up the GitHub process on any Kubernetes cluster, pointing and referring to one centralized Git repository. Let's say now I would like to do a change here. I'm on my GitHub repository and I have a pull request in place. And this pull request is just simply say, hey, I would like for my frontend, not one replica, but 3 replica. So that's where I could say, hey, with that, any configuration, Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes configuration, you will grab this new value to deploy it at scale. So that's what I'm doing here, merging and having that in my master branch. And now, if you see, It was too fast, but I have already 3 seconds ago added 2 more replica. So my application now is more resilient, etc., etc. So that's how fast and at scale I could centralize the way to configure applications and any, again, Kubernetes manifest. So that's the GitOps and deployment management and deployment of Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. The second feature is about policies, where Azure Policies is a way to set up, check, audit, and having capabilities for governance to make sure that you're compliant across your organization. And one of the aspects and illustration and example of policy definition we have, I should just deploy Azure resources on a specific location for a specific resource type. But in our context, it's about Kubernetes, so I could make sure that authorized IP or enable on the API Kubernetes server. PSP is enabled, RBAC is enabled, HTTPS ingress, that we have just internal load balancer and not public load balancer, etc., privilege container, etc. So I could apply, again, from Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes, such policy to any Kubernetes cluster. Another feature I would like to show you is about monitoring. With the opinionated monitoring tool we have on Azure Monitor for containers. And here I could again deploy on any Kubernetes cluster the Azure Monitor container agent and grabbing such metrics here about my cluster, my nodes, my containers. So again, having a centralized way to manage that setup, but also monitor and having more governance in place. And actually, that's it for Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. Hope you enjoy this presentation where we saw in action how you could onboard any Kubernetes cluster anywhere from any cloud, any sites you have. At edge as well, how you could deploy and actually onboard different Kubernetes manifests application at scale with GitOps, with Flux we have in place currently with Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. And the third part was about Azure policies and Azure containers and how you could have more security governance in place for the day 2 operation of your Kubernetes cluster, and again at scale. So hope you enjoy this session, and thank you for listening, and enjoy the rest of your Cloud Native Days, Montreal. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Mathieu, for this great presentation on Azure Arc. It was nice to learn a bit more about what is Azure Arc. We'll wait to see if there's a couple more questions coming in, but in the meantime, I got one for you. One question that we often get from customers or from people around, it's why would I want to use Azure Arc? And in the meantime, what would be our best way to get starting using Azure Arc?
Yeah, good question. Thank you, Felix. Actually, Azure Arc and any other motion currently we are seeing with Rancher as well as Enthos, for example, with GCP, is a way to manage hybrid scenario and multi-cloud scenario, right? Where at scale you have different, maybe Kubernetes cluster, and you would like to make sure you are consistent across the different teams and projects across the organization, and still about consistency of deployment, security, and governance, right? So that's very meant for that. And how to get started, I will paste the link to start with the documentation we have with Azure Arc, enable Kubernetes.
Great, thanks. We'll make sure that everybody receives that that link. Another question that I have for you is that you in your talk you're leveraging GitOps, and we saw one earlier by Flux as well, which is really neat. But is there another way to interact with Azure Arc, or do we absolutely need to ramp up and leverage the GitOps option?
Yeah, good question. So currently, the Kubernetes configuration we set up for a specific Kubernetes cluster, anywhere this Kubernetes cluster, again, is actually setting up and configuring Flux CD for a GitOps setup and practice. And currently, that's the way to do that, to have this consistent, again, repeatable and secure way to deploy YAML file on a specific Kubernetes cluster. So currently, that's the way to do.
All right, thanks. And I guess more information on the link that you just sent will allow us to get started with those GitOps as well, right?
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, thanks for being with us today, Mathieu. It was sorry. Oh, I think there's one more question.
Hey, Mathieu, it's Julia.
Yeah.
I just have a question for you about the Kubernetes Community Days in Quebec City. Can you give us a little update on what's happening with that?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So yeah, we are very excited, and with few other cities in Canada and all around the world. With the current situation with COVID-19, we have been postponing a bit this conference. We are targeting October, middle of October, for an in-person conference, hopefully. So we will keep posted the community around that. If it's going to be remote or postponed again, we don't know. Again, according to the situation, we don't know for sure. But yeah, really excited. We are keeping posted everyone registered or on the website. I could copy paste the website here. But yeah, that's uncertain time currently, but we are really excited.
Cool. Yeah, we spoke about it a little bit earlier around just what's happening with the Kubernetes Community Days, because we were talking about how Toronto and Montreal and Quebec City and Ottawa all wanted to do that event this year. So yeah, please keep us posted. Do you guys think you might do something remote if it doesn't happen in person, or do you think you'll postpone? That's one of the debates that we've had actually around like in person versus online. So curious just to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, the trends, and it's all around the world, is like, hey, are we doing that remote or postponing even in 2021? We don't know yet, but that's one of the possibilities we are talking about currently, yeah.
Cool. All right, well, thank you for this talk, and thank you for being involved. Félix, autre chose?
No, that was all good. Thanks again, Mathieu.
Thank you, everyone.
Pretty, really informative.